It wasn't a new weapon of steel or fire that saved Europe from the greatest army the world had ever seen. It was something the horsemen of the steppe had never truly faced before. Something that didn't move, didn't shout, and didn't bleed. When we talk about unstoppable military machines, few stories capture that idea better than what happened in Europe in 1241. No force had ever moved so fast or struck with such precision. The Mongols shattered everything in their path, and for a while, it looked like nothing in Europe could stand against them. Entire kingdoms fell in weeks. But what's even more fascinating is how that early dominance would eventually meet its limits. Welcome to Great History, where we uncover the real stories behind the turning points of ancient warfare. If you love learning how strategy, technology, and sheer human determination shaped history, hit that subscribe button and join us. So today, let's ask, what was the real secret weapon that destroyed the Mongols in their invasion of Europe? How could Europe defeat the mightiest horsemen on earth? And what happened when the Mongols came back once again, only to find a continent ready for them? Let's begin with how the Mongols utterly crushed the finest armies Europe had to offer. The rise of the Mongol Empire was no accident. It was powered by a rare and deadly combination: unmatched mobility and devastating long-range firepower. Their tactics were unlike anything the armies of medieval Europe had ever seen. European warfare back then was built around what you might call the honor code of battle. Two sides meeting head-on in open fields, charging, clashing, and settling it through brute force. But the Mongols didn't play by those rules. Their warfare was psychological, mobile, and surgical. They used deception as a weapon. The famous feigned retreat, where they'd pretend to run away, draw the enemy into disorganized pursuit, and then turn around to annihilate them, became their signature move. It worked again and again because European commanders simply couldn't imagine that a retreat might be deliberate. Their horse archers were the backbone of this system. Each Mongol warrior could fire arrows accurately while galloping at full speed, hitting targets hundreds of feet away. Imagine entire waves of mounted archers circling your position, loosing arrows that could punch through armor before you even got close enough to swing a sword. Meanwhile, Europe's knights, proud, heavily armored, and trained for shock combat, were built for short, intense charges. Their armor was heavy, their horses even heavier, and after one strong attack, coordination usually fell apart. They weren't designed for the kind of fast, flexible, hit-and-run fighting the Mongols mastered. But the real secret wasn't just in their weapons. It was in their discipline and command structure. Mongol armies were organized in precise units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, all under leaders who could adapt instantly on the field. Even after suffering heavy casualties, their lines stayed coordinated. They rotated fresh units into battle seamlessly, something almost no European army could do at the time. By contrast, the Hungarian forces they faced were often fragmented, with local nobles each commanding their own troops. When things started to go bad, communication broke down fast, and once that happened, defeat wasn't far behind. Two battles in particular showed just how overwhelming Mongol tactics could be. Mohi in Hungary and Legnica in Poland both fought in 1241. At Mohi on April 11th, the Hungarian army met the Mongols in what should have been a strong defensive position along the Sajo River. They had bridges, wagons, even some fortifications. But the Mongols, led by Subutai, arguably one of the greatest military minds in history, executed a near-perfect encirclement. They attacked from multiple directions at once, crossing the river at night using pontoon bridges. They launched volleys of arrows that tore through Hungarian lines before the main charge even began. And when the Hungarians thought the Mongols were retreating, They followed, right into a trap. By dawn, the field was chaos. Tens of thousands of Hungarian soldiers were dead or scattered. Entire units were annihilated before they ever reached melee range. The Mongols even brought siege engines into the open battle, catapults and possibly primitive gunpowder weapons learned from the Chinese, to smash through dense infantry formations. Imagine the shock of seeing siege machines used not against walls, but against men. The story was similar at Legnica, in Poland. European knights, brave but rigid in formation, charged directly into Mongol feigned retreats and were cut down from all sides. The result? 2 decisive Mongol victories that opened the heart of Europe, Hungary, Poland, even the Holy Roman Empire, to invasion. For a few terrifying months, it seemed like nothing could stop them. But then, something unexpected happened. History books often say the Mongols pulled back in 1242 because their great Khan, Ogedei, had died. That's partly true, but only partly. When the news reached them in late 1241, the Mongol commanders, Batu and Kadan, didn't pack up right away. They stayed in Hungary for more than half a year. If succession politics were the only reason, why linger? The deeper truth lies in something far less dramatic, but far more decisive: logistics. The Mongol war machine thrived on speed and open space. Their horses needed endless grasslands to graze, and their tactics depended on room to maneuver. But Europe wasn't the steppe. It was forests, rivers, mountains, and far fewer pastures. Their greatest strength, mobility, was suddenly becoming their greatest weakness. In Hungary's Pannonian Plain, they had some open space, but once they moved westward into Central Europe, everything changed. Dense forests slowed them down. Supply lines stretched thin. Their horses began to starve. And unlike in Asia, they couldn't live off the land easily. The villages had been burned or abandoned, and food was scarce. They'd also suffered more losses than most people realize. The battles had been bloody on both sides, and even if the Mongols won every engagement, their manpower wasn't infinite. Every dead or exhausted horseman meant less scouting, less mobility, and more risk. At the core of Mongol military doctrine was one simple idea: speed wins wars. They were masters of movement, striking hard and fast, forcing enemies to surrender before the real fight ever began. Their philosophy could be summed up in a single chilling phrase the Mongols were known for: submit now or die later. But here's the problem. That strategy only worked when battles were fought in the open, when the enemy locked themselves behind thick walls and refused to play by the Mongols' rules. The entire system broke down. Siege warfare was slow, painfully slow, and every day spent waiting at the gates was a day their horses weren't grazing, their mobility was shrinking, and their biggest advantage was slipping away. In fact, when Mongol commanders calculated whether to attack a fortress, they often performed what we'd call a cost-benefit analysis. If it would take too long or require too many men, they simply bypassed the target and moved on to easier prey. The numbers make this crystal clear. Take the siege of Xiangyang in China, for example, one of the best defended cities in the world at the time. The Mongols had to commit over 100,000 troops and spend several years building new siege engines to finally bring it down. Now compare that to their entire invasion force in Europe in 1241. Estimates range between 60,000 and 80,000 men total. That's right. Conquering one well-defended city in China required more manpower than their entire European campaign combined. There was simply no way they could sustain that kind of siege effort across dozens of stone fortresses in Europe. And that brings us to their next big problem: technology. Let's start with something that might surprise you. The weapon that helped Europe stand firm against the unstoppable Mongol cavalry was the crossbow. A weapon simple enough for a farmer to use, yet deadly enough to punch through Mongol armor. In a defensive role, the European crossbow had one critical edge over the famous Mongol composite bow. It didn't rely on strength, it relied on mechanics. Unlike a regular bow, which demanded raw power and constant tension from the archer, a crossbow locked its string in place, allowing the shooter to aim calmly at full draw. That meant greater accuracy, especially from behind castle walls, where defenders had time to aim, breathe, and fire with precision. The bolts, called quarrels, were short, thick, and brutally efficient. They didn't just pierce leather or lamellar armor. They could punch straight through chainmail and into the body behind it. Tests on medieval replicas show some quarrels could penetrate over a millimeter of steel plate at short range, more than enough to drop a horse or pierce a rider's chest. And here's the real strategic beauty of it. Crossbows didn't need a lifetime of training like longbows or composite bows did. A peasant, a tradesman, even a strong teenager or an older woman could learn to reload and shoot a crossbow with deadly efficiency after a bit of practice. That meant anyone inside a fortress could contribute to its defense. European defenders learned a simple rule. Don't aim for the rider, aim for the horse. Once you cripple the horse, the mighty Mongol cavalry becomes just another dismounted soldier on foot, stripped of speed and shock power. In a siege or defensive stand, that change alone could decide the battle. But of course, weapons alone weren't enough. The Mongols' greatest strength was mobility. Their ability to sweep around obstacles and attack from unexpected directions. So defenders had to make that mobility irrelevant. That's where anti-cavalry obstacles came in. Things like the cheval de frise or Frisian horse. Picture a wooden frame covered in spikes, like a giant star-shaped barrier that could be rolled into position to block an opening or protect a weak point in the wall. It wasn't just a European idea. Its origins go all the way back to ancient China, where similar horse-stopping devices called juma were used centuries earlier. Combined with trenches, pits, and wooden stakes, these obstacles turned the Mongols' speed into a liability. Charging into one of these defensive zones could break formation, and once that happened, a volley of crossbow bolts finished the job. And if the Mongols did manage to dismount and fight on foot, that's when long pole arms, spears, pikes, and ranseurs came into play. In tight formations like the schiltron, a dense circle of spearmen, infantry created a living wall of steel points. Against that, even the Mongols' elite cavalry tactics couldn't do much. Every step forward meant stepping into a forest of spearheads and wading bolts. But the most dramatic change of all came not from soldiers, but from stone. The Mongols were famous for adapting quickly. Wherever they went, they absorbed local expertise, especially in siegecraft. Persian, Chinese, even Muslim engineers worked for them, designing catapults, trebuchets, and early gunpowder weapons. But the Mongol army that invaded Europe under Batu Khan didn't have access to their empire's full engineering arsenal. The Golden Horde, as this western branch of the empire was known, was built for mobility, not for hauling massive siege engines across thousands of miles of steppe and forest. They did carry lighter trebuchets and stone throwers, good enough for smashing through wooden palisades or earthen walls. And that worked for a while. Smaller towns and wooden fortifications fell quickly. But when they ran into European stone architecture, everything changed. Compared to the sun-dried brick or rammed earth defenses common in Asia, these walls were practically indestructible. So even when the Mongols set up their siege engines and began pounding away, the stones barely cracked. What had once been their unstoppable advantage, the ability to adapt and destroy anything in their way, now met an immovable object. Literally. Nowhere was this shift more obvious than at Esztergom, the richest and most important city in medieval Hungary. Batu Khan targeted it for a simple reason. It was the jewel of the kingdom, filled with gold, relics, and treasures, exactly the kind of prize the Mongols wanted. The outer defenses of Esztergom, wooden towers and earthen ramparts, didn't last long. The Mongols smashed through them easily using their siege engines and fire arrows. But the real fight began when the defenders fell back to the citadel, the massive inner fortress built entirely of stone. That's where the invasion met its first real wall, in every sense of the word. The Mongols set up around 30 catapults and heavy stone throwers, hammering at the citadel day and night. But the walls held. The projectiles that could tear through timber simply bounced or shattered against the thick masonry. So Batu ordered a direct assault. The result? Catastrophic. The attackers were cut down by crossbow fire from the ramparts, and every attempt to breach the walls ended in blood and failure. This was a strategic dead end. The Mongols realized that even deploying 30 siege engines, the best they had on hand, wasn't enough to break a stone citadel. They lacked the counterweight trebuchets that would later become standard in Mongol campaigns in Asia, developed with the help of Persian engineers. In 1242, they simply didn't have those machines in Europe. What they had were smaller torsion-powered catapults designed for mobility, perfect for wooden walls, but almost useless against stone. The failure at Esztergom drove home a brutal truth. Conquering Europe would mean transforming their entire army into a slow, supply-heavy siege force, the exact opposite of what made the Mongols successful. They would need massive counterweight trebuchets, supply convoys, and stationary encampments. In other words, they'd need to become something they were not. And so, for the first time in the campaign, Batu Khan had to walk away from a prize he couldn't take. The citadel of Esztergom remained standing. As the Mongols pursued King Bela IV westward, they entered Croatia and the rugged lands of Dalmatia. And here, geography itself turned against them. The Dalmatian landscape was a nightmare for horsemen. Steep mountains, narrow passes, rocky valleys. The terrain that once gave them freedom to move and strike became a trap. Their horses couldn't gallop. Their formations broke apart. And worse, local Croatian fighters used the mountains to their advantage, ambushing Mongol columns in the narrow defiles. Losses mounted quickly. By the spring of 1242, the Mongols reached the stone fortresses of Klis and Trogir, perched high above the valleys. These strongholds were like medieval fortresses in the sky, built on elevated cliffs, impossible to surround fully, and manned by defenders who knew the terrain better than anyone. When the Mongols tried to storm Klis in March 1242, they were met with fierce resistance. The fortress walls, again solid stone, withstood bombardment after bombardment. The attackers were repelled, suffering heavy losses. Trogir held out too. It was the same story everywhere. Stone held, and the steppe horsemen bled for every foot of ground. And that's when the realization sank in. They could burn villages, they could slaughter armies, but they couldn't hold what they conquered. The wealth, the kings, the real prizes of Europe were locked behind walls that speed and fear could not breach. So the Mongols did what no army expected them to do. They turned back. By the time we reached the year 1285, Europe had already lived through the nightmare once. The Mongols had swept into Hungary in 1241 with devastating force-burning towns, crushing armies, and almost wiping the kingdoms off the map. But this time, things would be different. The Mongols came again, and they lost. Badly. The second Mongol invasion of Hungary, led by Nogai Khan and Talabuga, came some 4 decades after the death of Ogedei Khan. That's important because it completely removes the old theory that the Mongols' retreat in 1242 was just due to political turmoil, the so-called Kurultai theory. If politics had been the main reason for their withdrawal, this new invasion, free from internal distractions, should have succeeded easily. Instead, it turned into a disaster for the Mongols. The invasion lasted barely 2 months between late 1285 and early 1286. That's astonishing when you realize the first invasion had lasted more than a year and swept across much of Central Europe. This time, however, the Mongols met a Hungary that was fortified, prepared, and built to withstand them. The result? Almost the entire Mongol force was wiped out, while Hungarian casualties were minimal. Historians describe it bluntly. The Mongols suffered nearly total losses. So what had changed? After the Mongol invasion devastated Hungary in 1241, King Bela IV looked around and realized his castles were simply not enough. So Bela decided to make sure that would never happen again. He launched one of the most ambitious reconstruction programs in medieval Europe. From 1242 to around 1300, Hungary built between 147 and 172 new stone castles, each one a fortress meant to stop the Mongols dead in their tracks. And here's the clever part. Bela tied this program directly to his feudal system. If a noble wanted land, he had to build a castle first. In less than 60 years, the entire defensive map of Central Europe was transformed. That single decision created a network of fortresses across the kingdom. Not just isolated strongholds, but a web of mutually supporting defenses, which modern strategists would call defense in depth. Each fortress could act independently, holding out for weeks or months if necessary. Even if an open field army failed, the Mongols would face hundreds of small, well-defended hard points standing nearby, each capable of holding out for weeks. Now think about what that means for a nomadic army that depends on movement and foraging. The Mongols couldn't sit and siege 100 castles at once. They didn't have the supplies or the patience. Every extra day spent outside a fortress meant less food, fewer horses, and growing disease. The new Hungarian defense system wasn't just strong, it was unsiegeable. After Bela's reforms, the designs became far more sophisticated. Builders adopted concentric castle designs where 2 or more walls created layers of defense. If an enemy breached the outer wall, they'd be caught in a narrow killing zone between walls, surrounded by defenders raining bolts, stones, and boiling oil from above. They added moats, artificial lakes, and angled towers to eliminate blind spots. New architectural innovations like projecting galleries allowed defenders to fire straight down on attackers, trying to dig or climb the walls. Every design choice had one purpose: to make sure the next Mongol invasion, if it came, would fail before it even began. You could say that Bela IV had turned masonry into strategy, architecture as a weapon. And in 1285, that weapon was tested for the first time. Nogai Khan's Mongol army struck hard and fast, using their trademark hit-and-run tactics and trying to outmaneuver the Hungarian defenders. But the new Hungary was not the same open plain it had been 40 years earlier. Every advance was met by fortresses that refused to fall. When Mongol cavalry tried to outflank them, they ran into stone walls, impassable rivers, or fortified towns that fired back with volleys of crossbow bolts, weapons specifically designed to punch through Mongol armor. Every attempt at siege dragged on until winter set in. Supply lines stretched thin, and disease began to spread. By the end of the campaign, the Mongols weren't conquering Hungary. They were fleeing from it. Hungarian forces struck back as the invaders retreated through the Carpathians, inflicting devastating losses. Contemporary accounts describe the Mongol army as being almost entirely destroyed. This second invasion is one of the clearest pieces of evidence in medieval history that technology, not politics, was the decisive factor in Europe's survival. If the Mongols' earlier withdrawal in 1242 had truly been about internal politics, then this invasion, led by capable commanders and facing no political crisis, should have ended in victory. But it didn't. The same open plains, the same rivers, the same geography, yet the result was completely different. Why? Because the landscape had changed structurally. The kingdom was now dotted with stone fortresses that denied the Mongols their greatest weapon: mobility. The transformation was profound. What had once been an existential threat, an unstoppable horde sweeping across the continent, was now reduced to a regional nuisance. Hungary, once nearly destroyed, had become an unbreakable fortress of its own. And in that change, we can trace the moment Europe turned the tide. After 1286, the Mongols never again attempted a full-scale invasion of Central Europe. The reason wasn't diplomacy or distance. It was because the cost of trying had become too high. If you've made it this far, thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the most fascinating moments in history. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and share it with a friend who loves history as much as you do. And tell me in the comments, do you think the Mongols could have adapted if they'd stayed longer in Europe? Or was this truly the limit of their power? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow, right here on Great History.